By the mid-60s, the advancing technology of multi-track recording and mixing boards was beginning to influence popular music, perhaps more so than the electromechanical instruments of the time. Of course, musicians were using mellotrons, clavierworks, on the marteno, and electronic organs in their works, but the scope was finite. However, with the advent of recording technology, limitless possibilities emerged. You could play tracks backwards, speed up, slow down, utilize pre-recorded sounds, create loops, synthesize sounds, and employ so many other groundbreaking techniques. The fruitful 60s decade resulted in pop genre trespassing into the avant-garde Western classical scene, thereby extending its own horizons. The leading figures of this revolution were the Beatles. With assistance from producer George Martin, they sought to turn the recording studio into an important tool for creating music. In this video essay, I intend to discuss how the Beatles owe some of their acclaimed tracks to contemporaneous avant-garde and electronic composers. The prime focus is on the albums Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. Although the Beatles were among the first pop groups to use tape loops, tape reversal, variable speed playback, and musical collage in their works, they certainly were not the very first people to experiment with electronics. Decades before Beatles' ingenious Revolver, avant-garde composers such as Edgar Varese, John Cage, Karlheinz Stockhausen, and others were already creating pioneering works in the field of electronic music. It all began in 1948 when Pierre Schaeffer and his associates at the Studio d'Essai of the French radio system created Musique Concrète, which involves manipulation of raw sounds to establish musicality through everyday mundane noise. There's an interesting parallel in fine art, wherein collage technique artists started to introduce the real world into their paintings. Picasso, for example, during his Cubist period, pasted bits of newspaper onto his canvases. The aim was not to depict or represent newsprint, but to introduce reality into art. Symphonie pour un homme seul, Symphony for One Man Alone, by Schaeffer and Pierre Henry, is one of the first pieces that carries out modifications to recorded sounds through augmentation, diminution, playing backwards, varying pitch and intensity, and so on. Composer Olivier Messiaen showed interest in creating an electroacoustic work, collaborating with Henry on Timbre Dure, which utilizes sounds from daily life, especially water flowing from a tap. French-American composer Edgar Varese's Poème électronique is another significant piece that entails layering of sounds, sirens, machines, human cries and explosions, via magnetic tape. During the same period in the 50s, John Cage was busy developing chance music. Music of changes, for instance, made use of I Ching, a Chinese classic text, to make compositional decisions. Cage also inserted the idea of randomness to some of his electronic outputs. Fontana Mix is a prime example, a piece of work that explores indeterminacy, using a score and 4 multi-channel audio tapes. German composer Karlheinz Stockhausen produced several remarkable works that were key in the evolution of electronic music. Among the first electronic pieces created from basic waveforms, Study 1 and 2 utilize edited and reversed sine waves. Gesang der Younglinger is another notable work that again makes use of filtered and manipulated sine waves, fused with noise produced with a noise generator, in counterpoint to sounds of a boy singing. Stockhausen's magnum opus, however, is Contact, which is regarded as one of the first works to combine electronics and live performance. The composer here employs a 4-channel tape recording to complement live percussion and piano. Moreover, Contact also explores spatialisation. A 4-channel tape with 4 loudspeakers, combined with a strategic placement of live performers, allowed Stockhausen to intricately design his sound world. American composer Steve Reich's magnetic tape compositions, It's Gonna Rain and Come Out, were also notable tape works that became a landmark in minimalist and process music. In these works, Reich seeks to explore the concept of phase shifting, which involves simultaneously playing the same tape loop on different machines. Gradually, as the voices go out of sync, rhythmic interactions begin to surface. These seminal works, directly or indirectly, paved the way for groups such as the Beach Boys and the Beatles to experiment upon in the field of popular music. The former's Pet Sounds and the latter's Revolver came out in the same year in 1966, aimed at extending the boundaries. While Pet Sounds made noise for its unique instrumentation, especially in the percussion department, with the usage of cans, water bottles and juice jugs, which was previously unheard in the rock music arena, Revolver was regarded for its experimentation and technological advances. After gaining substantial fame worldwide with their pop classics, the Beatles wanted to do something different. They had performed extensively around the globe and now decided to put touring on hold for some time to sincerely experiment in a studio and try out ideas without the constant worry of having to reproduce the tracks for stage performances. Since the Beatles were at the peak of their popularity in 1966, it was a huge gamble to spend the next 4 years solely as recording artists. However, with gifted producer George Martin by their side, they did manage to strike gold. The first thing you notice about Revolver is that the very familiar instrumentation of the Beatles, guitar, bass and drums, was now being invaded by a range of new instruments and influences. Eleanor Rigby was the first track that did not have any of the Beatles playing on. The song features a string octet arranged by George Martin. Moreover, the lyrical content takes a departure from the Beatles' conventional love songs, telling the story of a lonely woman and her eventual death. Pre-recorded sounds, waves, bubbles, people talking, bells and machinery complement guitars, brass and drums in Yellow Submarine. While Love You Too incorporates Indian classical instruments such as tabla, sitar and tanpura as a drone. I'm Only Sleeping is one of the defining tracks of the album, featuring reversed guitar sounds. The idea to employ this was conceived when a studio engineer accidentally flipped a tape, leaving the band members astonished and amazed at the effects. A part for the guitar was then composed and played twice, forwards and backwards, with fuzz effects on one of the tracks, which resulted in a swirling effect. John Lennon wanted a paper-thin voice for the song, which Martin achieved by employing a circuitous process of speeding the track up and down. The most revolutionary track in Revolver, however, is Tomorrow Never Knows. Music historian Tom Holmes recognizes it as the song that ushered in a new era in the use of electronic music in rock and pop music. The track is also regarded as one of the first examples of psychedelic rock, with the lyrics enlightening the listeners to turn off the mind. With its dizzying electronic effects, artificial double tracking on vocals, and reversed instruments combined with other innovations, the music aims to mirror the reverberations of a hallucination by orally recreating what tripping feels like. The story goes that Lennon wanted his voice to sound as if he's croning from a hilltop, to which Martin responded by running the vocals through a rotating Leslie speaker. This produced a quirky oscillating sound, similar to the Doppler effect, which one can hear after the first interlude. The track also features reversed, sped up and distorted recordings of Paul McCartney's laughter, made to sound like seagulls, and him running his fingers along the brim of a wine glass, sitar and mellotron samples, and a B-flat major chord from Jean Sibelius's 7th Symphony. With the help of a vari-speed tape recorder, Martin was able to create variable textures in the song by constantly varying the pitch and speed of the tracks. Revolver managed to create a paradigm shift not only in the Beatles' discography, but in the way recording studios were perceived by artists all over the world. It was no longer a room to just mimic what you did in a live performance in order to distribute it to a wider audience or to keep it for posterity, but essentially a laboratory for innovation. Even the album cover was something different from what they were used to having, serving as a precursor to Sgt. Pepper's iconic poster. Instead of just the Fab Four posing, the cover has multiple copies of the band's faces, conveying that this record is to be deemed as experimental. The Beatles' next studio album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released in mid-1967, promised to be even grander. In the cover artwork, the Beatles are positioned in front of a sea of people, prominent figures from history and pop culture, those that the Beatles admired or were influenced by in some way, again explicitly conveying that the songs in the LP are rich and eclectic. To bring to life the layered complexity of the songs, each track involved meticulous planning. It took the Beatles nearly 400 hours in the studio during a 129-day period to realize one of their most ambitious projects. For the benefit of Mr. Kite, Martin was asked to construct a fairground production, wherein one could smell the sawdust, since the lyrics are inspired by an 1843 circus poster. To create a carnival atmosphere, he gathered several recordings of old steam organs on tape. However, to stimulate the atmosphere, the sounds had to be chaotic. Hence, in an act reminiscent of Cage's methods, he chopped up the tapes, threw them in the air onto the floor, and spliced them together in random order to make for a more authentic listening experience. These sounds were then layered onto sounds of harmonium, harmonicas, and finally fused with the song's main organ melody to create a whimsical aural kaleidoscope. A Day in the Life is notable for the two dissonant orchestral crescendos that serve as bridges between Lennon and McCartney's parts. To create those sections, an orchestra was brought in and all the players were asked to do glissandos on their instruments until they reached the highest volume. Martin was asked to create a basic score that outlined parts for the players, while still having a scope for improvisation. This sort of tightly controlled aleatory makes an appearance for the first time in a Beatles song, and arguably is one of the first instances of something so avant-garde in a pop song. The Beatles' next work, The Beatles, also known as the White Album, contains Revolution 9, a sound collage created by John Lennon that is clearly the most offbeat of the 30 songs. In the track, Lennon utilized several overdubbed vocals and speech, some of which were reversed. The loop number 9 that unifies the track is a sample that was chopped from an audio engineer's testing tape. Moreover, several short bits of classical music, the final chord from Sibelius's Symphony No. 7 and the reversed finale of Schumann's Symphonic Studies are sprinkled here and there. Most of these sounds are unrecognizable since they are heavily distorted. The track also features many distinguishable sound effects: car horns, laughter, gunfire, a cooing baby, glass, and crowd noise, among others. Number 9. The Beatles' significant innovation lies in the integration of recording technology into strong compositional ideas. The aforementioned albums, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and the White Album, present the band in its most adventurous and experimental state. Be it the use of variable speed tape recorders to correct pitch in Strawberry Fields Forever and to change the texture of voice in I Am Only Sleeping, or the decision to keep songs Good Morning and Revolution 9 a little strident since the tracks had to be bounced multiple times to accommodate all the sounds they imagined, the Beatles never made peace with technological restrictions. Taking a cue from the avant-garde composers of the time, they managed to create rich tracks without sticking to one particular formula or genre. Paul McCartney became interested in the avant-garde scene around 1966, particularly with the music of Cage and Stockhausen, seeking out concerts featuring their works. He applied some of the ideas in his own works for the band, evident in the chaotic orchestration of A Day in the Life, which is inspired by Cage's notions of randomness. John Lennon also began to experiment after his partner, Japanese composer and conceptual artist Yoko Ono, introduced him to Cage around late 1960s. The musical collage of Revolution 9 hints at the musique concrète works of Varese and Stockhausen. Both of them were cited as inspirations by Lennon. There are documented encounters between Italian composer Luciano Berio and McCartney as well, who bonded over a mutual admiration for Stockhausen's pioneering works, Gesang the Younglinge in particular. The experimental use of tape loops in Tomorrow Never Knows was largely triggered by McCartney's love for Gesang. The original raw sound sources are heavily distorted in the track, originating from Pierre Schaeffer's principles of musique concrète, wherein he demands the sounds to be unrecognizable. Conversely, the use of real-world sounds is also noteworthy in many Beatles tracks. Animal sounds in Good Morning, fire engine bell in Penny Lane, sounds evoking the sea, a party, and the submarine in action in Yellow Submarine, alarm clock in A Day in the Life. These sounds are used as evocative symbols, as opposed to Schaeffer's idea of employing unrecognizable sounds freed from their associations in the real world. Only a Northern Song is another unconventional Beatles track that was conceived during Sgt. Pepper's sessions, but failed to make it to the album. It features an eccentric set of instruments, timpani, trumpets, glockenspiel, and chimes, fused with a Hammond organ. Moreover, the song incorporates a montage of assorted sounds, including spoken voices and distorted bits of the aforementioned instruments. However, the highlight is the presence of two similar rhythmic tracks in the song, which results in a phasing effect. It is possible that the band was familiar with the music of Steve Reich and other minimalist composers of the time. The Beatles managed to design spaces in the majority of their works, despite initially using just a 4-track equipment and later stereo. In Yellow Submarine, for instance, all non-instrumental sounds, speech bits, machine sounds and other effects occupy different spaces, while in Tomorrow Never Knows, tom-toms seem to be appearing from a different point from the rest of the drum kit. This would have been achieved in the mixing process, which explains the longer durations they began to spend in the studio post-recording from the onset of Revolver. The Beatles' explorations in spatialisation is a nod to the efforts of Stockhausen, whose idea to capitalise on an acoustic space and contact can be marked as a precursor to the experiments of recording artists with spatial projections of sound, which eventually led to an innovation everyone is familiar with: surround sound. Stockhausen was one of the most groundbreaking and influential artists of the 20th century, whose indelible works continue to inspire generations of composers. It comes as no surprise then that Stockhausen is one of the faces that graces the cover of one of the Beatles' finest, Sgt. Pepper. The Beatles are to be credited for introducing avant-garde music to a lot of mainstream audiences, particularly through works such as Revolution 9, which on a side note spurred several John Lennon-Yoko Ono independent/experimental works. With Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, the Beatles brought a change of aesthetic to a recorded album, a fundamental change in how songs were perceived to be. The tracks were no longer an extension of a live performance, but acousmatic compositions that were not meant to be reproduced, stemming from the compositional tradition of musique concrète. Several critics bashed these albums at the time, agitated by the fact that the songs could not be performed on stage, only to realize years later that with technology, this is how music was destined to be consumed in the longer run. Although the Beatles dissolved in the early 70s, their music still stands the test of time. They launched the revolution of psychedelic rock, something which would become a huge movement in the years to come with groups like Black Sabbath, Jefferson Airplane, the Velvet Underground, Grateful Dead, The Byrds, The Doors, and Pink Floyd. The Beatles certainly opened up the world of rock and pop to all possible sounds by blending analog synthesis and avant-garde techniques with quality songwriting. They were able to achieve a fine balance by being receptive to avant-garde's weirdness and embracing new technology, which is the precise reason why pop music of that time still sounds fresh even now.